There is a line in the oldest surviving version of the flood story, older than Genesis, older than Noah, pressed into clay in a language that had been dead for 2,000 years before anyone thought to decipher it, that almost every later retelling quietly removed. In the original Akkadian, after the flood waters recede and the rain stops and the single surviving boat comes to rest on the mountain, the great gods who sent the flood are described as sitting in the dark, starving because the humans who fed them through offerings are all dead, and the gods have no other source. The text calls them hungry like flies swarming to a sacrifice. That is not a metaphor imposed by a modern translator. That is the word.
The carved lines that survived the desert winds tell us what was remembered. Yet between each fragment lies a silence, a chasm of stories lost. The
tradition read that line and made a decision. The gods should not look at that. In the later version, the one most people know, the one incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same scene was rewritten. The gods no longer starved. They feared the deluge. Their dignity was preserved. Their hunger was erased. One editorial choice, made in antiquity, and the nature of divine power in the flood tradition shifted permanently. This investigation is about what else was erased, about what the original versions of the divine war tradition read carefully in the languages they were actually written. Preserve about the conflict the Sumerians believed preceded, and in some sense necessitated the world as they knew it. About why 15 centuries of scribes kept returning to the same set of ruptures, kept rewriting the same divine conflicts with different protagonists and different outcomes, kept failing to produce a version that settled the questions the original had raised. The war did not end. That is what the records reveal when you read them together, not any single text, but the full tradition, in its contradictions and its revisions and its silences. 5 textual traditions across 15 centuries of recopying, and none of them ends with a resolution that holds. Each settlement generates the conditions for the next crisis. Each ending is an opening in disguise. That argument will be built here, piece by piece, from the clay up. It requires going slowly. The evidence is worth it. The way to the tablet is smaller than you expect. British Museum object 78941 sits in the Department of Middle East, collections a clay rectangle roughly the dimensions of a human hand, slightly convex on one face, the way fired clay tends to warp when it dries unevenly. The bottom half survives. The upper right quarter is gone, broken off somewhere in the 37 centuries between the moment a scribe in the city of Sippar finished pressing the final line and the morning in 1889 when Hormuzd Rassam's excavation team lifted it from the ground. Under magnification, the stylus marks are still clear. The scribe pressed harder on the first line than on any other, not dramatically harder. Just a degree or two of additional force, the kind of thing you notice only when you are looking for it. It might mean the scribe was new to this particular composition, or was copying from a damaged exemplar and wanted the opening to be legible, or simply pressed the way anyone presses when beginning something they consider important. We cannot know which. What we know is that it mattered enough to press harder. What we know is that the impression held. The colophon at the base of the surviving face, the scribal equivalent of a signature, identifies the tablet as a copy made during the reign of Ammi Saduqa, great-grandson of Hammurabi, placing it around 1635 BCE. It gives the name of the scribe partially. The first cuneiform sign is clear. The second is damaged. The third and fourth are gone with the missing corner, taking the name into permanent incompleteness. Someone copied this text, cared enough to press firmly on the opening line, and we cannot finish reading who they were. Wilfred G. Lambert and Alan Millard spent years assembling the surviving fragments of what this tablet carries, the Atrahasis epic, from pieces scattered across the British Museum's collection, and published their definitive edition in 1969, a work that for the first time made the full scope of the composition visible to modern scholarship. What BM 78941 preserves, in Old Babylonian Akkadian pressed into Sippar clay, is part of the oldest sustained account of a war among the Anunnaki, a war that did not begin with armies on a plain or a proclamation from heaven. It began with a group of gods who were exhausted, who had been working for 40 years without rest, and who one night set fire to their tools and walked to the gate of Enlil's house and refused to leave until someone listened. That is where the oldest version of the divine conflict starts, not with cosmic battle, with labour, with bodies that were tired and a governing structure that had pushed them past what was sustainable, and with the specific catastrophic consequences of a leadership that solved that problem not by reforming it, but by exporting it onto a new category of being that had no standing to object. The investigation begins there, but before it can go further into the texts themselves, it needs to establish something that most treatments of this material skip entirely the three interpretive frameworks the evidence actually supports, and why knowing which framework you are in changes everything about what the records appear to be saying. Three ways of ridding the same war there is a moment in the Ijiji revolt narrative when the workers set fire to their tools. They burn their digging baskets, their marutu at night, and the fire lights up the darkness across the plain, and Enlil wakes in his house to see the sky illuminated by his own workers' rebellion. That image is precise and specific, and it has been read three completely different ways by three generations of serious scholarship, and the three readings produce three different understandings of everything that follows. Thorkild Jacobson, whose 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness remains one of the foundational texts in Mesopotamian religious studies, would read those burning tools as a natural phenomenon encoded in mythological narrative. Enlil is wind. The Ijiji, in Jacobson's phenomenological framework, are forces embedded in the natural world, not administrators in a cosmic bureaucracy, but presences within natural phenomena, inseparable from them. The burning tools are the fires of drought, the cessation of irrigation, the moment when the water management forces of the natural world refuse to function. The divine revolt is what it looks like from inside a civilization that depends entirely on controlled water distribution, when the rains fail and the channels dry and the system stops working. Myth as phenomenology. The gods are the world's forces describing themselves. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose Sumerian mythology of 1944 was the first systematic English language treatment of these traditions, read the same burning tools as compressed historical record. The Ijiji, in Kramer's historicist reading, are the patron deities of subordinate city-states whose real political relationships with the dominant cities of the Sumerian pantheon Nippur, Eridu. The centres of Enlil's and Enki's authority were encoded in the mythology of divine hierarchy. The revolt is an actual political rupture, a real labour crisis in a real temple economy, given the durability and legitimacy of divine narrative so that it could be transmitted and understood. Myth as history. The gods are real events wearing cosmic disguise. A third reading, associated with Andrew George's philological work, and with the institutional analysis that Lambert's scholarship made possible, treats the tradition as sophisticated political theology. The burning tools are a formal legal act of renunciation, not a natural event and not a compressed historical record, but a precisely constructed narrative about the relationship between labour, authority and legitimacy. The gods are not natural forces or historical proxies. They are characters in a constitutional drama whose vocabulary, the legal terms for labour obligation, the juridical framework of divine authority, the specific procedures by which binding decrees are issued and contested, is drawn directly from the actual administrative and legal culture of early Mesopotamia. Myth as jurisprudence. The gods are ideas about power dressed in the language of persons. These three frameworks cannot be fully reconciled. They produce genuinely different meanings from the same text, and they are all present simultaneously in the scholarly tradition that has spent a century and a half reading these tablets. Zacharias Sitchin proposed a fourth reading, beginning with the 12th planet in 1976, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru who created humans as a slave labour force to mine gold. It is named here only to be set aside clearly. Sitchin's translations departed from established cuneiform philology in ways that specialists, including Michael S. Heiser, documented with considerable care. The framework is not supported by the texts read in their original languages within their documented cultural contexts. The genuine strangeness of what the tablets actually say does not require an extraterrestrial explanation to be worth serious attention. It requires the three frameworks above, held in tension, applied to a body of evidence that rewards exactly that kind of sustained, careful pressure. What this investigation argues, and this is the argument that the full evidence, assembled across 5 textual traditions, actually supports, is that the divine war was never a single event but a structural condition, a governing order that was constitutionally fragile from its first moment, organised around instruments and arrangements whose instability each attempted resolution exposed rather than repaired. The Igigi revolt was the first crack. The creation of humanity was the first failed repair. Everything that follows the flood, the theft of the Tablet of Destinies, the Great Babylonian Creation War, the devastation of Error, follows the same pattern. A settlement that worked in the short term generated the conditions for the next crisis in the medium term and left the fundamental constitutional fracture untouched. With that framework in place, the oldest layer of the tradition becomes readable in its full complexity. When the gods had to work the word that unlocks the Atrahasis epic's opening is Ilku. In old Babylonian legal documents, the hundreds that survive from Sippar and Nippur, recording land tenure, tax obligations, military service ilko denotes a core of labour obligation owed to the state or to a temple institution. It is a bureaucratic term, precise and impersonal, the kind of language that appears in administrative tablets alongside grain tallies and field measurements. It is not a poetic word, it is a legal one. And when the Atrahasis text opens by telling us that the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much, and then tells us that the 7 great Anunnaki were making the Igigi suffer the work, the verb used for that suffering is rooted in the same conceptual register as Ilku. The gods in the opening lines of the oldest divine war text are not fighting a cosmic battle. They are performing corv labour. They are building canals. Lambert and Millard's 1969 edition establishes this with considerable care. The Igigi were the junior tier of the divine hierarchy, subordinate to the great Anunnaki Anu, the sky god and divine patriarch Enlil, lord of wind and the executive power of the cosmos. Enki, lord of the subterranean freshwater ocean, the god of craft and intellect and productive cunning. The division of labour was clear. The Anunnaki presided, the Igigi dug. What they dug was the network of irrigation channels that made agriculture possible in the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, a region where the rivers flooded unpredictably, where the soil was rich but the water distribution uneven, where the civilization that would invent writing and the wheel and the city depended absolutely on the capacity to move water from where it arrived to where it was needed. The gods were digging Mesopotamia into existence. After 40 years, they stopped. The number 40 deserves a pause. It appears throughout ancient Near Eastern literature as a period of significant duration, 40 days of flood, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years of a king's reign. It is not a literal count. In the context of the Atrahasis prologue, 40 years of divine labour before revolt establishes that the Igigi's grievance cannot be dismissed as impatience. The text is making a legal point. The labour was unjust, not because it was briefly inconvenient, but because it had been sustained past any point of fairness. When the Igigi burned their tools, the maratu, the digging baskets, at night, the fire lighting the sky, they were performing an act of formal renunciation. They marched to the gate of Enlil's house and surrounded it. Enlil, awakened by the commotion, was afraid. The text says this plainly. The greatest of the executive gods, the one whose command could not be altered, the one who held the Tablet of Destinies, his first response to the sight of the Igigi assembled at his gate was fear. He sent his vizier Nusku to negotiate. Nusku went and came back and reported that the Igigi would not disperse, that their grievance was real, that they had borne the work for too long. Enlil wept. This is also in the text. The Lord of Wind and Fate sat in his house, surrounded by angry gods, and wept, and then summoned Anu and Enki for an emergency council. Anu's response at that council is the tradition's first structural signal. He acknowledged the grievance as legitimate. He did not dismiss it. The divine assembly, confronted with a genuine labour revolt, responded not with suppression, but with adjudication. This is not the behaviour of an omnipotent hierarchy. It is the behaviour of a political structure whose authority depends, however grudgingly, on the consent of those beneath it. Enki's solution, creating humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed minor god. With the birth goddess Mami shaping the figures and breathing life into them, was accepted by the assembly as the pragmatic resolution. The Igigi were freed. The work stopped. The revolt succeeded. But here is what the text registers without emphasizing, and what every subsequent crisis in the tradition follows directly from. The divine assembly's authority to assign corv labour was never challenged, never adjudicated, never reformed. The same structure that made the Igigi's work unjust was simply redirected onto a new category of being that had no standing to refuse. Mami, the birth goddess, who had shaped the humans with her own hands, said it at the moment of creation. The burden that had been on the gods was now placed on humans. Not resolved. Transferred, This is the argument this investigation builds across 5 textual traditions and 15 centuries of revision. The divine war never ended because the conditions that produced it were never genuinely resolved, only relocated. The Agigi's labour was transferred to humans. The stolen tablet would be recovered, but its location left ambiguous. The flood's damage to the cosmic order would be declared repaired, while the craftsmen who could actually make the repair were permanently gone. What the ancient scribes preserved across a millennium and a half of recopying is not the record of a war with a beginning and an ending. It is the record of a governing order repeatedly discovering that its own resolutions were incomplete and returning to the same constitutional fractures generation after generation, looking for a settlement that would finally hold. The first settlement did not hold. The text spends its second tablet explaining what happened next. The architecture of heaven, every civilization that has ever organized itself, has needed to answer the same administrative question: who decides, and on what basis does their decision bind the others? The answer Mesopotamian theology gave was precise, physical, and in some ways startling. The authority that made Enlil's decrees irrevocable was not a quality of his character or a mandate from a higher power. It was an object. A clay tablet sealed with a cylinder seal its impression pressed into the wet surface, the way signatures functioned in actual Mesopotamian legal practice, as proof of consent, as evidence of obligation. The upi empty. The tablet of destinies. To understand what that means, hold for a moment the physical reality of a cylinder seal impression. A carved stone cylinder, small enough to hang from a cord around the neck, pressed and rolled across wet clay. The carved image transfers a god, a worshipper, a star, a stylized tree in a continuous band of impression around the surface. That impression is not decoration, it is a signature. It constitutes the legal reality of the document in the same way a modern signature constitutes the legal reality of a contract. Remove the impression, and the document is not merely unsigned, it is legally void. Andrew George, in a 1986 paper published in the journal Iraq, that remains the most careful scholarly treatment of the tablet's function, argued precisely this: the tablet of destinies was a juridical instrument, not merely a symbol of power. It constituted authority the way a legal deed constitutes ownership, not by representing the fact of ownership, but by being the fact of ownership. Whoever held the tablet held the Enlilship, not as a metaphor, as a structural legal reality of the divine order. The consequences for reading the war tradition are significant. If the tablet is a juridical instrument, then its theft is not merely a military act or a power grab. It is the nullification of the contract that makes the cosmic order functional. The M2, the destinies or decrees that the tablet embodies, are not descriptions of how things are. They are the binding force that makes things be that way. Without the tablet, Enlil's authority does not simply pass to someone else. It ceases to exist. The cosmos does not become leaderless. It becomes legally void. The World Blundell Prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, inscribed around 1800 BC, the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian king list, offers a parallel piece of evidence. The list tracks royal succession from before the flood through the historical dynasties of the early second millennium, and it structures history as a sequence of constitutional transfers. Kingship descends from heaven to a city, the city falls, kingship descends to another. The flood appears as a rupture that severs the antediluvian sequence from the historical one, but the mechanism of every transfer is the same. Kingship, like the Enlilship, is an institutional function that can be moved, lost, stolen, and recovered. The cosmos is governed not by permanent divine appointment, but by a constitutional arrangement that is always, in principle, in play. This is not a marginal theological position. It is expressed across multiple independent textual traditions spanning from the early 2nd millennium through the 1st. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, whose primary version survives in Ashurbanipal's Kuyunjik library at Nineveh, makes the transfer of the Tablet of Destinies the climax of its divine war. Marduk receives the tablet from Anu as confirmation of his sovereignty over the cosmos. It does not merely reward his victory, it constitutes his sovereignty. He cannot be the legitimate king of the gods without it. But the Enuma Elish was composed centuries after the Atrahasis epic, and its political purposes are visible once you know where to look. Babylon's supremacy in the Mesopotamian world required theological justification. The elevation of Marduk, a god who does not appear prominently in the oldest Sumerian texts, to the position of cosmic king, required rewriting the order of divine precedence in a way that made Babylon's political moment look like the fulfillment of cosmic destiny. The Enuma Elish is a sophisticated piece of retrospective constitutional revision encoded in creation mythology. Lambert recognised this, and so did every subsequent scholar who works seriously with the text, which means the architecture of heaven, as the records actually preserve it, was never a stable structure temporarily disrupted and then restored. It was always organised around a tablet whose possession was contested, whose authority was juridical rather than ontological, and whose transfer from one holder to another carried consequences the texts describe with a precision that demands to be taken seriously. The constitutional arrangement could be legally voided. It had been before. It would be again. What that looked like in practice is the subject of the tradition's next major movement. The moment the tablet was stolen, the cosmos went legally dark, and the divine assembly could not initially find anyone willing to do anything about it. The bird that knew the sky in the British Museum's collection from the palace at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu. The Assyrian capital, built by Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BC there, is a pair of alabaster wall reliefs catalogued under Museum number 1851,902.502. Each panel stands roughly 2 metres high. Together they show a winged divine figure, identified by cuneiform inscription as Ninurta, in pursuit of a creature combining the body of a massive eagle with the head of a lion. The creature is Anzu. The figure's hands hold thunderbolts. The inscription does not describe the theft. It does not identify the moment of the scene. It labels the protagonist and implies the pursuit. Confident in the way institutional art is confident, it assumes the audience already knows the story and needs only the reminder. The confidence is interesting precisely because the story it assumes its audience knows survives in at least 2 substantially different versions, whose details the relief diplomatically ignores. The Anzu myth exists in an Old Babylonian version found at Susa, where the hero is Ningirsu, patron deity of the city of Lagash, and in a standard Babylonian version from the Kuyunjik collection, where the hero is Ninurta. Stephanie Daly's translation in Myths from Mesopotamia covers pages 203 through 227. The 2 versions differ on who defeats Anzu and on several narrative details that turn out to matter for what the story is actually claiming about the nature of divine authority. But both versions agree on what happened and why it was catastrophic. Anzu, whose name derives, as Jacobson noted, from an early phonetic variant of the Sumerian dim dot dagod, meaning approximately heavy wind or dark cloud, was a divine creature, specifically a guardian of Enlil's sanctuary on the mountain. He was trusted, he had access. Every morning, the text tells us, Anzu washed Enlil's face and cleaned his feet, the intimate service of a divine attendant. Every morning he looked at the tablet of destinies hanging on Enlil's breast. The text lingers on this. Anzu gazed at the tablet repeatedly. The word implies prolonged, focused attention, not a passing glance, but the fixed stare of someone forming a plan. He watched the tablet. He watched Enlil. He calculated. And one morning, when Enlil had gone to bathe and left the tablet unguarded, Anzu took it. What happened immediately after is the text's most precise cosmological statement. When Anzu seized the tablet of destinies, Enlil's powers ceased to function. The divine radiance, the Malamu, the terrifying luminosity that marked the great god's authority, went dark. Enlil's mouth opened, and no binding decree emerged. The executive power of the cosmos stopped, not because Anzu was stronger than Enlil, but because the tablet was the instrument through which Enlil's authority was constituted, and without it the authority itself evaporated as legally and completely as a contract whose original document has been destroyed. Anu called the divine assembly into emergency session. He asked 3 gods in succession to fight Anzu and recover the tablet. 2 refused. The text does not record their reasons at length. It records the refusal. The divine assembly, confronted with the collapse of its own constitutional basis, could not initially find anyone willing to act on its behalf. This is not a heroic opening. It is a governing body in crisis, its authority suspended, its members calculating personal risk. Ninurta eventually agreed, persuaded, in some versions, by his mother Mami, whose appearance at multiple crisis points across these traditions is worth noting, and went to the mountain where Anzu had retreated with the tablet. The battle is described in what might be called kinetic theological detail. Ninurta fires arrows. Anzu deflects them by invoking the tablet's power, commanding the arrows to return to the trees and birds from which their materials came. The arrows unassemble themselves in flight. Their feathers, wood and sinew reverse their trajectory and return to their origins. This is what it means for the tablet to be in the wrong hands. The cosmic order runs backward. Causality itself becomes reversible. Ninurta's eventual victory achieved through a strategy involving his divine weapon Shurua, which could travel between the battlefield and the divine assembly, as a messenger involved striking Anzu at specific vulnerable points. The details vary between versions. The outcome does not. Anzu is defeated and the tablet is recovered. But here is the detail the Nimrod relief diplomatically declines to depict. After Ninurta defeats Anzu and recovers the tablet, the standard Babylonian text of the Anzu myth does not explicitly state that the tablet is returned to Enlil. Ninurta holds it. The assembly praises him. His epithets are enumerated in triumphant celebration. And then the surviving text, fragmentary at precisely this point, moves into praise hymns that describe Ninurta's divine functions without clearly resolving the question of where the tablet ends up. George noted this ambiguity in his 1986 Iraq paper. The tablet's post-war location in the Anzu tradition proper is not as settled as the triumphant surface of the narrative suggests. The relief from Nimrod shows the pursuit, not the return. It shows the moment of military engagement, not the moment of constitutional restoration. The institutional art that decorates an Assyrian palace chooses with a precision that may or may not be entirely accidental to depict exactly the part of the story where Ninurta's authority is unambiguous, and to omit exactly the part where the question of what happens next is unresolved. The relief silence about the tablet's final location is the same silence the text contains. Constitutional resolution, in the Anzu tradition, is something the narrative gestures toward without quite arriving at. The war ended. The question the war raised did not. 40 Years of Fire, the Atrahasis tradition, was not composed by people who had never seen a labour dispute. The oldest elements of the text those scholars have identified as potentially reaching back to Sumerian originals before the Akkadian consolidation describe the Ajiji's condition in terms that the legal and administrative record of early Mesopotamia makes legible as something more than metaphor. Temple institutions in 3rd millennium Sumer operated on organised labour service. Workers owed the temple a portion of their time. The temple owed them rations, oil, wool. When the system worked, it was a functional exchange. When administrators extended the labour season without increasing payment, workers walked. We have records of this. Clay tablets from Nippur and Lagash and Jeosu record grain shortages, labour shortages, complaints from supervisors that their workers had gone to their own cities, a phrase that in administrative context means something very close to what the Ajiji do in the myth. They refused. They left. They stopped. The literary choice to describe divine cosmic labour using the specific vocabulary and behavioural patterns of actual institutional labour is not accidental. It is the text's way of making a point about power, about how authority functions and how it fails, about what happens when those at the bottom of a hierarchy are given no legitimate mechanism for redress. Enki's solution, when it comes, is presented as clever, and in its immediate terms it is. The creation of humans transfers the labour obligation from beings who can effectively refuse to beings who, in the divine cosmology, have no standing to refuse. The Ijiji are freed. The canals are dug. Enlil's authority is preserved. But Mami's speech at the moment of creation is the passage that the tradition never lets go of, even as later scribes softened other elements around it. She declares that the burden that had been on the gods has now been placed on humans. Lambert and Millard's translation renders this as a statement of transfer rather than relief. The burden did not disappear. It moved. The problem the Ijiji revolt identified, that the cosmic order required more labour than those performing it could sustain, was not solved. It was externalised. The divine order was protected from its own structural unsustainability by creating a category of being designed to absorb that unsustainability in perpetuity. What follows is therefore not surprising, however rapidly it arrives. A stylized 1200 years pass, and the human population has grown large enough that their noise prevents the gods from sleeping. Enlil, whose sleep has been disturbed, does not ask himself whether the terms of the original arrangement were fair. He begins planning how to reduce the population. The first attempt is plague, personified as the god Namtar. Enki, who has been the humans' quiet advocate since the creation, instructs Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise priest-king of Shuruppak, to redirect all worship toward Namtar alone. The other gods, deprived of offerings, pressure Namtar to stop. The plague ends. The second attempt is drought, sent by Adad. The same counter-strategy works again. Enlil's fury at Enki's interference is, at this point, fully earned by the narrative. He convenes the divine assembly and extracts from Enki a binding oath, sworn before the full council, juridically complete, that Enki will not warn the humans again. Enki swears. The flood is authorized. Its date and duration are set by divine council with the same administrative precision that the Corv obligation had originally been set. This is where the text does something that only becomes fully visible when you understand Mesopotamian contract law. Enki, bound by his oath, goes to the reed hut where Atrahasis sleeps and speaks to the wall. He addresses the hut's structural material, not its occupant. He says, and Lambert and Millard's translation preserves this precisely, "O reed fence, O wall, listen, O reed fence, convey this. O wall, heed," and then he tells the wall about the flood in enough detail that Atrahasis, lying on the other side, can hear every word. This is a formal legal workaround of a kind that appears in actual Mesopotamian contract law, the use of a fictional intermediary to convey information that a binding oath prohibits conveying directly. The oath said Enki would not warn the humans. Technically, he warned the wall. Whether a Babylonian lawyer would have found this persuasive is an open question. Whether the scribes who transmitted this tradition across centuries considered it an act of genuine ingenuity or desperate circumvention, the text does not adjudicate. It moves forward. The flood comes. The ark is built. Atrahasis and at least one woman survive. And then Mami turns on Enlil. Her speech after the flood delivered when the rains stop, and the gods, who have been starving because their human worshippers are dead, swarm to Atrahasis' altar like flies, is the most politically charged moment in the entire Atrahasis tradition, and the one least quoted in popular treatments of the myth. She says, as Lambert and Millard translate it, "Why did you, Enlil the greatest warrior, not fight the rebels, but decreed the flood instead?" The accusation is precise and devastating. She is pointing out, with complete accuracy, that the problem the flood was designed to solve, human overpopulation and noise, was caused by the original arrangement the Divine Assembly accepted to avoid fighting the Igigi revolt. Enlil had chosen not to confront the Igigi directly. He had made a deal. That deal created the humans. The humans became the problem. The flood was the cost of having avoided the original confrontation. Everything Enlil chose not to resolve in the revolt's aftermath was paid for by the flood's dead. The bottom of BM 78941 does not preserve Enlil's reply. The upper right quarter of the tablet, where the reply might have continued, is the missing corner. The scribe pressed those lines too, and they are gone. The silence where Enlil's answer should be is the first debt the tradition does not pay back. It will not be the last. What the tablet contained, the Upiminti, appears across 15 centuries of cuneiform literature in enough different textual contexts that what the scribes actually understood it to contain becomes a genuine philological exercise, not because the texts are vague, but because they are specific in different ways at different times, and the specificity evolves. In the Atrahasis epic, the tablet is primarily associated with Enlil's authority to issue binding decrees. In the Anzu myth's standard Babylonian version, something has expanded. When Anzu seizes the tablet, the melamu of the gods, the divine radiance that marks authority, goes dark. The tablet in this version is not just a legal document, it is an energy source, a radiating centre of legitimate power whose presence sustains the visible manifestation of divine authority. Without it, the gods do not merely lose their legal standing, they lose their luminosity. By the Enuma Elish, the tablet has become the prize that constitutes divine kingship itself. Marduk receives it from Anu after defeating Tiamat. He cannot be the legitimate king of the gods without it, not because the assembly has decided so, but because the tablet is the instrument that makes the decision real. The 2019 Cambridge and Oxford intertextual study, published in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, identified something in this progression that matters for the war tradition's full meaning. The study found specific passages in the Enuma Elish that appear to quote or rework the Anzu myth in ways that are not generic borrowing but active recontextualization. Phrases that describe Anzu's power in the earlier text reappear in the Enuma Elish as phrases describing Tiamat's power. The structural parallel is not coincidental. The Enuma Elish does not just tell a new story. It retells the old story with a different victor, implicitly claiming that the Marduk-Tiamat conflict is the definitive version of the divine war that the Anzu myth had described incompletely. Consider those two passages side by side. In the Anzu myth, Anzu's power over the tablet allows him to reverse causality arrows unassemble in flight, returning to their origin materials. In the Enuma Elish, Tiamat's power allows her to absorb the attacks of the young gods until Marduk alone can find the approach that defeats her. Both describe the same structural problem: authority in the wrong hands creates a resistance that conventional force cannot penetrate. Both resolve the problem through the same mechanism: a champion who uses not greater power but a different kind of intelligence. The Enuma Elish is reading the Anzu myth and revising its constitutional conclusion. Where the Anzu tradition left the tablet's final location ambiguous, the Enuma Elish places it firmly and permanently, or so it claims, in Marduk's hands. But this claim required annual renewal. W.G. Lambert, whose final major work, Babylonian Creation Myths, was published in 2013, was careful about this. The Enuma Elish's primary function was ceremonial. It was recited on the fourth day of the New Year festival in Babylon, the Akitu, in a ritual that annually reenacted and renewed the cosmic order. The text was not primarily read, it was performed. The resolution it asserted was not a historical conclusion, but a ritual beginning the cosmic order restored at the new year so that it could be lived through for another year and restored again. The constitutional settlement the Enuma Elish proclaimed had to be reproclaimed every year because it was not actually settled. The war did not end at Marduk's victory over Tiamat. The war required annual ceremony to remain ended. This is the pattern at the heart of the divine war tradition, not a fixed record being faithfully preserved, but an ongoing argument being continuously revised, each revision trying to settle what the previous one had left open, each settlement generating the conditions for the next revision. The war did not end. The scribes kept rewriting it because the questions it asked kept remaining unanswered. What the tablet contained across all its versions was not a fixed set of encoded information. It contained the ongoing negotiation over what the gods were permitted to be and what the humans who recorded their nature needed them to remain. And in the Poem of Error, the tradition's final major movement, The one that comes after the Enuma Elish's triumphant assertion, the negotiation, finally stops pretending to be resolved. The God Who Came Back Angry British Museum Collection, Object K 1282, is a fragment of one of the most unusual compositions in the cuneiform literary tradition. The poem of Error, surviving across approximately 5 tablets and around 750 lines, roughly 2/3 recovered, was attributed in an authorial colophon to a man named Kapti Ilani Marduk, son of Dabibi, who claimed the poem was revealed to him in a dream. He added that whoever memorized it would be spared from plague and sword. This is, in the cuneiform literary tradition, an unusual claim. Most Akkadian literary compositions do not announce themselves as divinely revealed protective amulets. The attribution to a specific named human author is also less common than the attribution to divine authority or anonymous tradition found in older texts. The most defensible reading, given the poem's unusual self-promotional colophon, is that Kapti Ilani Marduk was positioning a new composition as protective scripture, a calculated move in a culture that took textual talismans seriously. Whether he also genuinely believed in the dream he claimed as his source, the text cannot tell us, and the two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. What the poem contains is a narrative in 5 tablets describing the near total destruction of the civilized world, and an explanation for why that destruction was possible that cuts to the deepest structural vulnerability the divine war tradition had spent 15 centuries circling. Erra, the god of war and plague, characterized in earlier texts primarily as a disease god, but in this poem as a force of devastating violence, is restless. He has been at peace too long. His weapons are idle. His 7 divine warrior companions, the Sebeti, are agitating for action. His herald Isum tries to restrain him. The poem's opening tablets record the argument between Erra's hunger for destruction and Isum's awareness of consequences with a specificity that reads less like divine mythology and more like a meditation on the psychology of war, on the gap between a military force's desire for conflict and its messenger's knowledge of cost. What precipitates the catastrophe is a manipulation of Marduk. Erra approaches Marduk in his temple and tells him that his divine image has deteriorated, that the gold and lapis and cedar wood of his cult statue have been damaged, that the craftsmen who could restore them are no longer present. Marduk's response is the poem's theological centre. He says the craftsmen who could restore his statue are the Apkul, the 7 antediluvian sages. The divine craftsmen who had existed before the flood and who had been responsible for establishing the technical and intellectual foundations of civilization. The Apkul, Marduk says, were scattered after the flood. He sent them into the ocean. They are no longer available. Without them, he cannot restore his own image. Without the restoration of his image, he cannot function properly as the god of the cosmos. Luigi Cagni's 1969 critical edition L'Epopea di Erra and Daly's English translation both identify this passage as the poem's structural revelation. The Apkul are not a minor detail. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the antediluvian sages were the beings who transmitted divine knowledge to the earliest human kings, who taught the arts of civilization before the flood, and whose absence after the flood constituted a permanent reduction in the world's capacity for order. Marduk's admission that he cannot reconstitute the world without craftsmen who no longer exist is an admission that the world after the flood is not fully restored to its pre-flood condition. Something has been permanently lost. The settlement that ended the Atrahasis crisis, the flood, the provisional arrangement about human mortality. The re-establishment of the divine order did not recover everything the war's first movements had cost. The restoration declared at the flood's end was restoration to an already reduced world. Marduk has been governing a diminished cosmos without acknowledging the diminishment. Error has just made him acknowledge it. Hearing that Marduk is compromised, Error persuades him to leave his throne temporarily to go abroad while Error maintains order. Marduk agrees. He steps aside. The moment Marduk is gone, Error unleashes destruction on the human world with a thoroughness the poem describes in detail, designed to feel contemporary rather than ancient. Cities burn, families kill each other. The king's men slaughter their enemies and then their allies and then anyone they encounter. The just and the unjust die without distinction. Babylon, the sacred city, Marduk's own centre, is sacked. Isham tries repeatedly to moderate Error's violence. He is partially successful. He manages to pull Error back from absolute annihilation, but he cannot stop the war. Error responds eventually not to reason, but to exhaustion, to having done enough destruction that the appetite for destruction is momentarily satisfied. Marduk returns. Error, satiated, returns to his seat. Isham makes a speech assigning meaning to the destruction. Retroactively, it was necessary. The world will be renewed. The poem closes with Error blessing those who honour the poem and promising protection to the city that preserves its text. But the Apkul are not mentioned in the restoration. The craftsmen Marduk could not reconstitute before the destruction are not reconstituted after it. The world Error destroyed, the world Marduk returns to govern, is the same diminished world it was when Marduk left. The restoration Isham announces is a restoration to an already reduced condition. The poem, which has been precise about the nature of the reduction, does not pretend otherwise. Kabti Ilani Marduk, son of Dabibi, lived, scholars estimate, somewhere in the first millennium BC, probably between the 10th and 8th centuries. In a world that had experienced repeated military devastation, the Assyrian campaigns, the political fragmentation of Babylonia, the periodic sacking of cities including Babylon itself. His poem is not simply a mythological narrative. It is a poet's meditation on what war costs that no declaration of victory recovers, written in the vocabulary of divine conflict, because that was the tradition's language for the deepest things, and because the deepest thing war reveals is not who won, but what cannot be rebuilt. The war that would not stay ended, the Enuma Elish, whose title means, in Akkadian, when on high. The composition's first two words opens not with conflict, but with non-differentiation. There was no sky, there was no land. There was Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingled together in the dark before creation. From their commingling, the first gods emerged, and almost immediately the young gods became noisy. The structural parallel with the Atrahasis epic is not accidental. In both texts, the problem that initiates divine conflict is noise, the young gods, or the humans, making a disturbance that disrupts the peace of the older powers. In the Enuma Elish, Apsu proposes to eliminate the young gods. Tiamat initially objects, Apsu is persuaded, and then Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, learns of the plan, kills Apsu preemptively, and establishes his dwelling place over Apsu's body. The war in the Enuma Elish begins as a preemptive strike by the god of craft intelligence against the authority that was about to destroy him. Tiamat, after Apsu's death, is persuaded by her counsellor Kingu to raise an army. She fashions monsters, dragons, serpents, lion demons, and makes Kingu her commander, pressing the Tablet of Destinies to his chest to give him authority. The tablet moves again. Kingu's possession of it is presented as illegitimate, a counterfeit constitutionality, echoing the Anzu myth's crisis in a new narrative register, and making the same structural point: the tablet in the wrong hands does not merely grant the wrong person power. It inverts the order whose legitimacy the tablet was supposed to guarantee. The young gods cannot find anyone willing to fight Tiamat until Marduk offers himself as champion in exchange for permanent supremacy over the divine assembly. If he wins, his word must be law. The assembly agrees, performs a test to confirm his divine power, and the constitutional bargain is made before the war is fought. The settlement is negotiated before its military precondition is achieved. This is the Enuma Elish's most revealing moment of political logic. The divine order knows, before the battle, what kind of order it wants to be when the battle is over, and it commits to that order as the price of finding someone willing to fight for it. Marduk defeats Tiamat by catching her in a net and driving wind into her open mouth until she cannot close it, then splitting her body to form the sky and the earth. He takes the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu's breast and presses it to his own. He then creates humanity from Kingu's blood, exactly as the Atrahasis tradition created humanity from the blood of a sacrificed minor god to perform the labour the gods require. The parallel between the two creation of humanity sequences is tight enough that the Cambridge and Oxford intertextual study identified it as deliberate illusion. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk is present at the creation of humanity as its architect. Enlil is not present at all. The constitutional revision is thorough. The older hierarchy is not overthrown. It is simply written out at the moment that mattered most, and a new centre installed in its place. Lambert's Babylonian creation myths emphasises that the Enuma Elish's primary function was ceremonial, recited on the fourth day of the Akitu New Year festival. Performed rather than read, its claims renewed annually rather than established once. The resolution, it asserts, was not a conclusion, but a repeated beginning. The cosmic order restored at the new year so it could be lived through for another year and restored again. Which means the Enuma Elish is not actually the end of the divine war. It is the ritual insistence that the war has ended, performed annually in the full institutional weight of Babylonian religious ceremony, to an audience that included the king and the priests and everyone else whose civilization depended on the continued functioning of Marduk's authority. Annual renewal is a form of acknowledgement. You only renew what might not survive without the renewal. Ground after the flood, Hormuzd Rassam, working for the British Museum at the Sippar excavations in 1889, recovered BM 78941 from the vicinity of the ancient temple archive. Rassam was an Assyrian Christian from Mosul who had spent his career partly in Henry Layard's shadow. He was Layard's assistant on the Nineveh excavations of the 1840s and 1850s. The one who actually found the library of Ashurbanipal in 1853, and by 1889 he was conducting his own fieldwork, methodical within the standards of late Victorian archaeological practice. The tablet came out of the ground in the condition it is in today, bottom half upper right quarter missing, surface chipped. He would not have known what it contained. It reached London, entered the collection, and waited for a philologist capable of reading Old Babylonian Akkadian cuneiform to work through its surface. That took time. The tablet sat in the collection while the systematic reassembly of the Atrahasis corpus was underway across multiple institutions, simultaneously scholars comparing fragments in London with fragments in Philadelphia and Istanbul and Berlin, slowly piecing together a text no single museum possessed in its entirety. The flood sequence that BM 78941 partly preserves is, in the Divine War's narrative logic, simultaneously the war's most violent act and its most revealing failure. The gods need human offerings. They need the smoke of sacrifice, the grain libations, the animal blood poured at the altar's base. When the flood eliminates humanity except for Atrahasis and his ark, the gods are left without the infrastructure their worship depends on. In the Atrahasis text's most startling formulation, the one that later scribes removed the divine beings who sent the flood find themselves starving in the silence they created. Geoffrey Tagay, in his careful analysis of the Gilgamesh editorial tradition, identified the specific change. In the Atrahasis version, the Anunnaki was sitting in thirst and hunger. In the Gilgamesh version, the gods feared the deluge. The editorial choice removed the scene of divine suffering and replaced it with divine awe. The gods remain frightened by the flood, but they are frightened as observers, not weakened as participants. Their dignity is preserved. Their dependence on human offerings, the fact that the gods needed the humans they had just killed, needed them desperately enough that their absence constituted a crisis, is erased. What the softening removes is the flood's deepest theological implication, that the divine order and the human order were not simply creator and creation, master and servant, but mutual dependencies with asymmetric terms. The gods needed humans in a way they had not fully accounted for when they made the decision to create them. The Igigi needed them to do the labour. The Anunnaki needed them to supply the offerings. The flood that was designed to reduce the human population to a manageable level came close to reducing it to zero, and the divine assembly's response in the Atrahasis account was not satisfaction. It was panic, hunger, and then Mummy's accusation. The settlement that follows, proposed by Enki, accepted by an assembly that had run out of better ideas, introduces new mechanisms to manage human population, mortality made permanent, barrenness incorporated into the human condition, limited lifespans. Enlil, having no better proposal and being too hungry to prolong the argument, accepts. The settlement holds. The tradition moves forward. But what it carries forward is the memory of a divine assembly that authorized a flood to solve a problem it had itself created, whose greatest birth goddess subsequently accused its greatest warrior of cowardice, and whose executive authority, the Tablet of Destinies, had already been stolen once, and would be contested again in the next major textual tradition the scribes maintained alongside this. 1. The ground after the flood is not solid ground, it is ground that remembers being underwater, and the specific damage the flood did to the cosmic order the permanent loss of the Apkul, the antediluvian sages who could have made real restoration possible, does not appear in the Atrahasis account. It appears centuries later. In the mouth of a compromised Marduk explaining to Error why he cannot fix what needs fixing. The flood's hidden cost is paid slowly, across the full span of the tradition, in a currency the Atrahasis scribes did not yet know how to name. Enlil's silence and Enki's argument there is a gap in the divine council scene of the Atrahasis flood sequence that is easy to pass over and worth sitting with precisely because of that ease. Between Enlil's decision to authorise the flood and the actual onset of rain, the text describes a process of deliberation setting of dates, determination of duration and scope that uses the same administrative vocabulary as the earlier labour assignment scenes. The flood is not a spontaneous expression of divine rage. It is a planned operation authorised by council vote with a scheduled start date and the same bureaucratic precision as a Corv calendar. Enki was present when the date was set. He swore his oath. Enlil made Enki swear before the gods in the hearing of the full divine assembly. The oath matters because its legal form determines the nature of what Enki does next. In Mesopotamian legal practice, an oath sworn before a divine assembly was among the most binding possible obligations. To violate it directly would not merely be a moral transgression, but a constitutional one. It would undermine the legal framework on which the entire divine order rested. Enki, who is throughout the tradition the god of wisdom and the Abzu, understands this constraint better than any other god in the pantheon. His solution is elegant, precisely because it takes the constraint seriously. He does not break his oath. He fulfills the letter of it while subverting its intent, using the reed wall as a fictional intermediary in a way that is formally defensible but substantively obvious to anyone paying attention. Walter Burkert, in his 1992 work The Orientalizing Revolution, noted the deep structural parallel between the Enki-Atrahasis relationship and the Greek tradition of Prometheus, the figure of a divine being who is technically subordinate to the ruling power but maintains a covert loyalty to human interests that repeatedly brings him into conflict with that power's decisions. Whether one accepts Burkert's full argument about cultural transmission between Mesopotamian and Greek traditions, the structural similarity is real. Both figures use cunning rather than force, work within formal constraints rather than defying them openly, and pay a cost for their advocacy that the narrative records with something that is neither simple approval nor simple condemnation. Enki's argument, the one he never makes directly, because he cannot, is implicit in the reed wall speech. It is an argument about proportionality. The noise problem that motivated the flood is real. The text does not dismiss it, but the solution was disproportionate. Enki, who knew the humans more intimately than any other god, having participated in their creation at the technical level, understood that the flood's elimination of humanity was not just strategically unnecessary, but cosmically dangerous. A universe without humans was a universe without offerings, without the agricultural labour that sustained the temple economy, without the prayers that gave the divine functions their earthly anchor. Enlil's flood plan was, in Enki's reading, self-defeating. Enlil won the council vote. Enlil's flood happened. Enlil's flood nearly destroyed the divine order's material basis. Enki's workaround preserved one family against which the divine order rebuilt. The flood's aftermath, the provisional settlement about mortality and barrenness, was Enki's arrangement proposed by Enki, accepted by an assembly that had run out of better ideas. In the tradition that follows, Enlil becomes progressively less central. By the Enuma Elish, he is a background figure. By the Poem of Error, he is barely present. The god who held the Tablet of Destinies, who authorized the flood, who wept when the Igigi surrounded his house, the tradition shows him slowly receding from the centre of the divine order across the centuries as if the events described in the Atrahasis had exhausted something in the constitutional authority his position had rested on, without anyone in the tradition ever making this explicit. The silence where his answer to Mami's accusation should be runs through everything that comes after, not just in the damaged clay of BM 78941, in the entire tradition. What the Laments remembered the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, published in 1940 by Samuel Noah Kramer. Preserved in 11 songs and 436 lines composed in the Isin Lhasa period after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur to the Elamites and Amorites, around 2004, Basi addresses the moon god Nana, patron of Ur, with a directness that is almost uncomfortable to read across the distance of 4,000 years. Ur is personified as a woman. She appeals to Nana to intercede with Enlil. She describes the destruction of her temples, the killing of her people, the abandonment of her streets. She does not describe this as the outcome of a divine war between the Anunnaki. She describes it as the consequence of a divine decision made in the divine assembly, with Enlil's authorization for reasons the lament does not question or analyse. The gods decided to abandon Ur. The Elamites were the instrument. The decision was not negotiated with the city's patron god. Nana was informed of it as a fait accompli. The scribes who composed this lament had access to the major literary traditions of the Sumerian and early Akkadian periods. They knew the Atrahasis tradition. They worked in the same temple scriptoria where the divine conflict myths were copied and studied. They chose not to invoke the war tradition when they described the destruction of Ur. They chose the register of abandonment, a decision, not a battle in a register that positions the city and its people as supplicants addressing an authority that has made a choice they cannot reverse, only mourn. This is an interpretive decision with real consequences, and Kramer and Jacobson disagreed about what it meant. Kramer read the laments as historical documents, as records, however stylized, of real events experienced by real people whose cities were really destroyed. The theological language was a frame for a historical experience that was primarily political and military and human. Jacobson was more cautious. He saw the lamentation genre as ritual technology texts performed as part of temple ceremonies designed to appease gods who had been offended, to ritually re-establish the divine presence in a damaged temple, to use the formalized enactment of divine grief as a mechanism for restoring divine favor. In his reading, the lament is not primarily a response to a historical event, but a ritual performance designed to move the gods through mourning toward a return that the performance was designed to produce. Both readings find evidence in the text. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur names specific structures, the Great Ziggurat, the Ekishnugal Temple, specific gates and storehouses with a geographic and architectural specificity that suggests someone who knew Ur, who had been inside it, who remembered what was where before the Elamites came. The text's theological structure is equally consistent with Jacobson's ritual reading address forms and rhetorical structures found in temple hymns and divine praise poetry, not in narrative or historical prose. The text is performing something, not merely recording something. What neither reading fully accounts for is the ending. Nana does not return. The lament addresses him across its entire length, with accumulating urgency and formality and grief, and the text closes without divine response. The final songs describe the destruction in its physical detail, the bodies, the abandoned streets, the collapsed walls, the empty storehouses, and address Nana's absence not with the confidence that he will return, but with the plea that he might. A ritual text designed to produce a specific outcome would typically conclude with the achievement of that outcome, or at least with strong expectation of it. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur concludes with the city still destroyed and the god still absent. The lament for Nippur, preserved in the Penn Museum's CBS collection, takes the same non-resolution as its endpoint. Nippur, which the excavation records document as repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt across the 3rd and 2nd millennia, is addressed with the same formal supplication as Ur. Its specific temples are named the Ekur, Enlil's house, the Kir, its inner sanctuary, the Ubukina, the Divine Assembly Hall. The lament preserves the moment of destruction without projecting into the future either restoration or permanent loss. This is, held alongside the divine war tradition, a remarkable compositional choice. The war tradition, in all its major forms, ends with some kind of resolution. The Igigi revolt resolved by the creation of humanity, the Anzu theft resolved by Ninurta's victory, the Enuma Elish war resolved by Marduk's sovereignty, the Era devastation resolved, however incompletely, by Marduk's return. The lament tradition, which describes the human experience of what happens when the divine order ruptures at the level of civic life, does not provide that resolution. It stays in the unrealized appeal. It holds the silence where the divine response should be. The Nippur tablet collection, the thousands of tablets excavated by the Penn expeditions, now distributed between Philadelphia and Istanbul and Baghdad, preserves both traditions in the same archival deposit. The temple scribes of Nippur maintained the war myths and the laments in the same libraries, copied them on the same clay, stored them in the same rooms. The two traditions were not separate bodies of knowledge held by separate communities. They were the same body of knowledge, addressed to different aspects of the same reality. The laments did not tell the story of the war. They recorded the shape of the silence the war left what it felt like to live in a city the gods had abandoned. Knowing the mythological framework that explained the abandonment, and finding that the framework explained it without making it survivable. The lament for Nippur names temples that were eventually rebuilt outside the text by rulers seeking legitimacy through Nippur's endorsement. The lament text does not know this. It was composed in the experience of destruction, not in the knowledge of restoration. It holds destruction without restoration, because that was the moment it was written to hold. The restoration happened in history that the text could not see. Whether the divine war ended the same way with the restoration that occurred outside any surviving text, visible only in the history that followed, is a question the ancient records pose without answering. The unanswered lament there is a moment in the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, when the personified city stops addressing Nana and simply describes what she sees. The wind came, the storm came, the storm that destroyed everything that the god authorized, that no human action could prevent or reverse. The walls that were strong crumbled, the gates that were sealed were broken open. The people who were many became few, the streets that were full became empty. The description continues across several lines with an accumulation of detail that is not poetic amplification, but inventory, the precise enumeration of specific things that are gone, not the stylized grief of a literary performance. Or it is that. And also something else, the habit of mind that Mesopotamian civilization developed across 3 millennia of writing, the habit of counting what you had and noting what was missing, the administrative reflex applied to catastrophe because it was the only tool available for making catastrophe legible. The scribes of the Isin Lhasa period who composed the lament understood the divine war tradition. They understood the Tablet of Destinies and the constitutional logic of the Divine Assembly and the difference between Enlil's executive authority and Enki's cunning advocacy. They had access to all of it. And they sat down in the aftermath of Ur's fall and wrote a lament that addresses the gods as if none of that background knowledge existed, as if the only available frame was a city speaking to an absent god about what she had lost. Because that was the frame they needed. Not to explain the destruction the war tradition already explained it, but to survive it, to hold it in language that preserved the relationship with the gods even after the gods had authorized the catastrophe, to maintain the practice of address even when address produced no response, to go on speaking into the silence, because ceasing to speak would mean something worse than silence. 5 textual traditions across 15 centuries of recopying, and none of them ends with a resolution that holds. The Atrahasis epic ends with a provisional arrangement about human mortality that the texts never revisit for verification. The Anzu myth ends with Ninurta praised and the tablet's location constitutionally ambiguous. The Enuma Elish ends with a ritual assertion of cosmic order that required annual renewal because the assertion was not self-sustaining. The poem of Error ends with the Akul still absent and the world still diminished, and a claim that the poem's memorization provides protection, as if the most useful response to divine war's aftermath was not political reconstruction, but the careful preservation of the text that described it. The laments end without divine return. 5 endings, none of them final, each one generating the conditions, the unresolved constitutional question, the unreturned craftsman, the annually renewed ceremony, the unanswered address for the next movement in a tradition that could not stop because the questions it was asking could not be closed. This is the argument the evidence supports, assembled across the full span of the tradition. The divine war was not a single event with a victor and a resolution, but a structural condition of a governing order organised around instruments whose possession was always contestable, whose authority required constant renewal, and whose legitimacy depended on arrangements that each successive crisis revealed to be less stable than they had appeared. The war did not end. The scribes kept writing because the war kept not ending, and because writing about it was the only available mechanism for thinking through what the failure of resolution meant for a cosmos, for a city. For the people who lived in the cities, the cosmos sometimes decided to abandon. What the records actually reveal, British Museum tablet 78941, sits in the Department of Middle East, its bottom half visible, the upper right quarter still missing after 37 centuries. The colophon is at the surviving base. The scribe's name begins clearly, and then the clay chips away, and the rest is gone. We know the composition he copied. We know the general period, the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, around 1635 BCE. We know the city Sippar on the Euphrates, where the temple of Shamash maintained a library tradition that preserved texts through multiple political disruptions. We do not know who he was. beyond the first cuneiform sign of a name pressed into clay by a hand that pressed harder on the opening line than on any other. What he copied was not simply a story about gods who went to war. He copied a constitutional record, a tradition that had been arguing across the centuries before him and the centuries after him, about the nature of authority and the cost of its failure, about what happens when the instrument of legitimate power is stolen, about what the beings at the bottom of a hierarchy owe to the beings above them, and vice versa, about whether a settlement that works in the short term is the same as a settlement that holds. The ancient records reveal this, not a single final war, but a tradition that kept returning to the same constitutional fractures. The Igigi revolt exposed a labour arrangement whose unsustainability was not resolved but transferred. The Anzu theft exposed a juridical order whose legitimacy depended on a physical object that could be removed. The Enuma Elish War produced a settlement that had to be reenacted annually to remain a settlement. The Era devastation revealed that the entity in whom that settlement was invested was governing a world already diminished by the flood's permanent costs, and that his temporary absence was enough to let everything collapse. The laments recorded what the framework looked like from inside the collapse, and found that the framework explained the catastrophe without making it less catastrophic. Each of these was a war. None of them was the war. There was no single war, no single final battle, no moment when the divine order achieved a stability that did not require the constant pressure of ceremony and recopying and revision to maintain. The war was the condition of the cosmic order, not an interruption of it. The scribes who copied BM 78941 pressed harder on the first line, maybe because it was important, maybe because they were beginning something and the beginning felt like it deserved weight. They worked through the text, line by line, into a story that had been told before them and would be told after them, a story about a war that had no single ending because the questions it asked were never quite finished. The scribe added the colophon, smoothed the edge of the tablet, maybe, the way a person smooths what they have completed before setting it down. Set it down. 37 centuries later, in 1889, Rassam's team lifted it from the ground at Sippar. It moved from ground to surface, from Mesopotamia to London, from one kind of preservation to another. It is in the museum now. The stylus marks are still clear under magnification. The first line was pressed harder than the rest. The name of the person who pressed it is incomplete. The text they copied is not. Wherever you are receiving this in a quiet room, or letting it carry you through a late night somewhere, that tablet is still in its case, still holding the pressed marks of a hand whose name ends in missing clay. The lament for was never answered in the text, but the city was eventually rebuilt outside the text in the slow movement of history that the scribes writing in the aftermath of its destruction could not yet see. The scribe whose name we cannot finish reading pressed harder on the first line, then kept going, line after line, into a story that was already old, that would outlast everything around it. That we are still after all of this still reading, it is still there. The cities that carried the story there is something the transmission history of the divine war tradition reveals that the texts themselves do not announce directly. The cities that preserved these records were not passive containers, they were active editors. Every time a political centre rose or fell, every time the theological weight of the Mesopotamian world shifted from Nippur to to Babylon to Nineveh, the scribal communities that moved with that shift brought the texts with them and revised them to fit the new centre's needs. The divine war was not preserved despite the politics of Mesopotamian history. It was shaped by them continuously in ways that are visible once you know where to look. Nippur is the place to begin, because Nippur is the place that did not change when everything else did. Unlike Ur or Lagash or Babylon, Nippur was never a political capital. No dynasty ruled the Mesopotamian world from Nippur. No king built his palace there and issued his legal codes there and named his armies in the city's honour. What Nippur had instead was Enlil, the Ekur-Enlil's great temple, the House of Wind, the institutional centre of the executive power of the cosmos, stood at Nippur throughout the 3rd and 2nd millennia, surviving political disruptions that destroyed other centres. Rebuilt by successive dynasties, not because Nippur had military or economic power, but because legitimacy in the Mesopotamian world required Enlil's endorsement, and Enlil's endorsement required the Ekur, and the Ekur required Nippur. A king who controlled Babylon but not Nippur controlled a city. A king who controlled Nippur had a claim on the cosmos. The Penn Museum's cuneiform collection, assembled from the University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur between 1888 and 1900, the largest scientific excavation of a Mesopotamian site conducted in the 19th century, reflects this. The tablets recovered from Nippur's temple archive include administrative records, school texts, mathematical exercises, hymns, laments, and literary compositions in proportions that reflect an institution operating simultaneously as a temple, a library, and a scribal school across more than a millennium of continuous occupation. The Atrahasis texts from Nippur, when compared with the Sippar tablets and the Kuyunjik versions, show variants that are neither simply older nor simply newer, but differently inflected preserving. In some cases, readings that the Sippar tradition had already moved away from, and in other cases showing the influence of theological priorities specific to Enlil's city. The Nippur scribes had an institutional investment in Enlil's dignity that the Sippar scribes, working in the temple of Shamash, the sun god, did not share to the same degree. When the Nippur tablets preserve slightly different readings of the council scene, slightly different weightings of Enlil's authority versus Enki's cunning, these are not random scribal variations. They are editorial choices made by a community whose institutional survival depended on Enlil's continued relevance. This matters because it means the divine war tradition, as we have it, is not a single tradition at all. It is a family of traditions related by common material but differentiated by the institutional priorities of the communities that maintain them. The Enlil of the Nippur tablets and the Enlil of the Sippar tablets are recognisably the same character, but they are not identical characters. The differences are small, but across 15 centuries of transmission, small differences accumulate into significantly different theological portraits. What Nippur preserved above all was the memory of the Igigi revolt as a moment of genuine constitutional crisis, not merely a narrative prologue to the creation of humanity, but an event that established the terms on which the entire subsequent tradition would operate. The Nippur scribal tradition did not soft-pedal Enlil's fear when the Igigi surrounded his gate. It did not compress or abbreviate the scene of divine weeping, where the Kuyunjik tradition, operating under Assyrian patronage with different political needs, sometimes compressed the council scenes. The Nippur variants held them in full. The executive god of the cosmos was afraid and wept and had to summon help. This stayed in the record. Nippur needed it to stay because Nippur's theological function, the endorsement of legitimate kingship, depended on a model of divine authority that was not merely power, but something more like earned standing, which required the memory of a moment when that standing had been genuinely challenged. The scribes who changed the story Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria from 668 to approximately 627 BCE, sent agents across Mesopotamia with instructions that survive in his correspondence preserved in the Kuyunjik collection. Find the tablets, the letters say, copy them, bring them back. If the tablets are the property of a private family, negotiate for them. If they are temple property, copy them in situ and bring the copies. Bring everything: omens, hymns, laments, literary compositions, medical texts, astronomical observations, whatever the temples and private collections of Babylonia and the older Sumerian cities hold. The library was a project of deliberate assembly, motivated by something between genuine scholarly curiosity and the political need to demonstrate that Assyrian civilization was the legitimate heir to everything that Sumerian and Babylonian culture had produced. The resulting collection, approximately 32,000 tablets and fragments, now distributed across the British Museum. The Iraq Museum and other institutions is the single most important archive of cuneiform literature that survives, but it is an archive with a perspective. Ashurbanipal's scribes did not copy everything neutrally. They made choices about which versions to prefer, which variant readings to adopt, which compositions to include, and which to leave behind. The Old Babylonian Anzu version from Susa, where Ningirsu rather than Ninurta is the hero, does not appear in the Kuyunjik collection. Whether this is because the Assyrian scribes did not know it, or knew it and found it theologically or politically inconvenient to the standard version they were establishing, cannot be determined from surviving evidence. The absence is its own kind of statement. What the Kuyunjik collection standardized across the Divine War tradition was a version of the story in which the resolution was cleaner than the older traditions had left it. The Anzu myth, in its Kuyunjik form, celebrates Ninurta's victory with an extensiveness that the fragmentary Susa version does not match. The Enuma Elish, which the Kuyunjik collection preserves in its most complete surviving form, presents Marduk's sovereignty with a comprehensiveness that leaves less room for the constitutional ambiguities visible in older, less editorially processed versions of the Divine War tradition. The Kuyunjik collection is the ancient world's most ambitious editorial project applied to its most ambitious theological tradition, and the result is a body of texts that is simultaneously the fullest record of what the tradition contained and a curated selection of what the tradition was allowed to mean. George's 1986 analysis of the Tablet of Destinies in the context of royal ideology demonstrated that Ashurbanipal's editorial project was not merely archival. Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal's grandfather, had destroyed Babylon in 689 BC, an act of political and military violence that required theological justification of considerable sophistication. Because Babylon was not merely a city but the centre of Marduk's cult, and destroying it was theologically equivalent to attacking the divine order itself. The justification Sennacherib's scribes produced used the framework of the Divine War tradition directly. Sennacherib was figured as a divine agent removing an illegitimate power from the sacred centre. in language drawn from the Anzu tradition's description of Anzu's theft and Ninurta's corrective action. The destruction of Babylon was rewritten in Assyrian royal propaganda as the restoration of proper cosmic order Babylon as the site of illegitimate divine authority, Sennacherib as the instrument of its correction. This is the divine war tradition operating not as mythology or as theology, but as political vocabulary. The constitutional framework the scribes had developed across 15 centuries of revision the tablet of destinies, the legitimacy of the Enlilship, the difference between authority rightfully held and authority usurped, became the language in which actual military campaigns were justified to actual political audiences. The myth was not separate from the history. It was the vocabulary the history was written in. Ashurbanipal's library project, seen in this light, is not just the preservation of ancient literary culture, it is the consolidation of the vocabulary in which power was legitimised the establishment of a standard version of the divine war tradition whose constitutional framework would underwrite Assyrian claims to cosmic authority. The scribes who made the copies were not just copyists, they were the custodians of the language of legitimacy. What remains when the tablets break there is a category of evidence in the study of the divine war tradition that is easily overlooked because it requires attention to absence rather than presence to what the tablets do not say. To where the clay is damaged at precisely the revealing moment, to which versions of a text did not survive the specific accidents of fire and burial and excavation that determined what came out of the ground when the 19th century archaeologists arrived. The Atrahasis epic, as Lambert and Millard assembled it, has three major manuscript sources: the Old Babylonian tablets from Sippar, which include BM 78941, the Nineveh Library version from the Kuyunjik collection, and a set of additional fragments from various provenances assembled piecemeal across the Penn, British Museum and other collections. No single manuscript preserves the complete text. The assembled edition in Lambert and Millard's 1969 publication is a scholarly construction, a composite text, built from the pieces that survived, with gaps marked where no surviving fragment fills the space, with bracketed restorations where the parallel versions allow informed reconstruction and explicit acknowledgement where they do not. The gaps are not evenly distributed. They cluster at specific moments in the narrative with a frequency that is not statistically random, that reflects instead the specific stresses that certain parts of the text were subjected to in antiquity. Tablets that were frequently consulted, frequently copied, frequently handled, wore out faster. The sections of the Atrahasis that were most actively used most frequently read aloud. Most frequently cited in scribal school exercises, most frequently referenced in the religious and administrative life of the temple institutions that preserve them, are paradoxically the sections most likely to be damaged, because damage accumulates with use and not only with neglect. Which sections were most used? The creation narrative, the flood, the moments of divine counsel and decision. These are the sections that appear most frequently in scribal school practice texts, most often cited in later compositions that draw on the Atrahasis tradition, most extensively represented across multiple independent manuscript traditions. They are also, not coincidentally, the sections where the surviving evidence is richest, where the gaps in one manuscript are filled by parallel preservation in another. The sections that are most completely lost are the transitional passages, the narrative connective tissue between the major dramatic moments, the passages that establish the pacing and the causality of the story's movement from one crisis to the next. These sections were apparently less frequently copied in school contexts, less frequently cited in later compositions, less likely to be preserved in multiple independent manuscripts. Their loss means that the Atrahasis epic as we have it is a series of dramatic peaks connected by reconstructed valleys: the creation, the revolt, the flood, the aftermath, each scene vivid and detailed, the movements between them partially speculative. This has consequences for interpretation that scholars have not always been fully explicit about. The sections we understand best are the sections that were most important to the scribal communities that preserved the tradition. The sections we understand least are the sections that mattered less to those communities, or that were considered too familiar to require extensive copying, or that were in some way less central to the theological and institutional purposes the tradition served. Our picture of the Divine War's narrative structure is shaped by what the ancient readers valued, not only by what the ancient scribes composed. The parallel problem exists in the Anzu tradition. The Old Babylonian Susa version, which names Ningirsu as the hero, survives only partially. Its tablet 2 was the subject of Klaus Wilke's analysis, but the full scope of the composition cannot be reconstructed with confidence. The Kuyunjik version, naming Ninurta, is more complete, but still fragmentary at the constitutionally crucial moment, the aftermath of Anzu's defeat, and the question of the tablet's final location. If the Kuyunjik scribes were preserving a version of the tradition that settled this question more clearly than we can now recover, the damage to those specific tablets has removed the settlement from our record. If the tradition was genuinely ambiguous at that point, the damage is preserving that ambiguity faithfully. The two possibilities cannot be distinguished from outside the text. What remains then, when the tablets break, is a record that is both more fragmentary and more interpretively demanding than a complete text would be. The gaps are not simply losses, they are the places where the tradition's own pressures the use, the revision, the selective preservation, the editorial choices made across 15 centuries of transmission left their mark in the form of absence. Reading the Divine War tradition fully means reading its gaps as carefully as its surviving text, asking not just what the clay says, but what the missing clay was carrying, and why it is missing at the specific moments it is. The answer is never fully available, but the question is always worth asking, because the question itself is part of what the tradition has left us the permanent incompleteness of a record that was always being revised, always being partially lost, always being partially recovered, always carrying more than any single tablet could hold. The long conversation 15 centuries is a long time to keep arguing about the same questions. From the earliest recoverable layers of the Atrahasis tradition reaching back, in some reconstructions, to Sumerian originals of the early 3rd millennium through the poem of Error, composed somewhere in the 1st millennium BCC, the Divine War tradition was continuously maintained, revised, and recirculated in the scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia. No other body of literature from the ancient Near East sustained such a long and coherent engagement with the same set of constitutional and theological questions across such an extended period. The question of why it lasted that long is not simply answered by pointing to the quality of the writing, though the writing is genuinely remarkable. It lasted because the questions it was asking were the questions that Mesopotamian civilization, in its political arrangements, its theological commitments, its administrative structures, could not stop asking. How is legitimate authority constituted? What happens when the instrument of that authority is removed or contested? What is owed by those who govern to those who are governed? What is the relationship between the violence of divine decision and the suffering of human experience? Can a cosmic order that has been damaged be fully restored, or does each crisis leave a permanent reduction that subsequent settlements must accommodate? These questions were not abstractions for the communities that maintained this tradition. They were the questions that determined whether a city had standing to claim divine endorsement for its king, whether a temple had the authority to levy labour obligations on its dependents, whether a military campaign could be justified as cosmic restoration rather than condemned as impious destruction. The divine war tradition was not the background to Mesopotamian political and religious life. It was one of the primary languages in which that life was conducted. The conversation the tradition sustained was not between scholars working in isolation. It was between communities with competing interests, competing political claims, competing understandings of which divine figure held the ultimate constitutional authority and on what basis. Nippur argued for Enlil, Eridu argued for Enki, Babylon argued for Marduk. Each city's argument was made partly in political terms and partly in theological terms, and the theological argument was made partly through the revision and recontextualization of the texts that carried the divine war tradition. The Enuma Elish is the most complete surviving example of this, a composition designed to settle, definitively and ceremonially, an argument that had been running for 1,000 years. Its annual recitation at the Akitu festival was the ritual equivalent of repeating the argument every year, in public, in the most authoritative possible institutional context, to an audience that included everyone whose civic and religious identity depended on the answer. The argument was never fully settled, because arguments about legitimacy are never fully settled. They are only more or less effectively suppressed, more or less thoroughly institutionalized, more or less broadly accepted across the communities whose consent gives the settlement whatever stability it has. The Enuma Elish settled the argument for Babylon's period of political supremacy. The Poem of Error unsettled it, not by proposing a different answer, but by showing what happened when the person in whom the settled answer was invested briefly stepped aside. The Lament tradition recorded what the argument looked like from the perspective of the cities that lost, that found themselves on the wrong side of a divine decision they had not been consulted about and could not appeal. What the long conversation reveals, read in its entirety, is not the content of a mythological narrative, but the shape of a civilization's ongoing engagement with its own deepest uncertainties. The Mesopotamians did not believe in a divine order because it was obvious, or because it was comfortable. They believed in it because they had been arguing about it for 15 centuries, and the argument, however unresolved, was the closest thing they had to a shared framework for making sense of a world in which cities were destroyed by floods and armies, in which divine decisions seemed arbitrary from the human vantage point, in which the gap between how things should be and how they were kept refusing to close. The scribes who copied and revised and recopied the divine war tradition across those 15 centuries were not preserving a fixed account of what had happened. They were participating in a conversation about what was still happening about the nature of the world they lived in, the authority they lived under, the losses that had not been recovered, and the restorations that had not held. They pressed their styluses into wet clay, harder on some lines than others, and added their voices to a conversation that had begun before them and would continue after them, that we are still in some sense reading these tablets 4,000 years later, still participating in. The Divine War's final word has not been spoken. The tradition knew this. It built the knowledge into its structure, into every provisional settlement, every ambiguous resolution, every unanswered lament. The war did not end because the questions that made it necessary were never finished. The clay holds them still, open